السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعل المحكمة الجنائية المركزية أو أولد بيلي في لندن شهدت أخيراً على جلسة استماع تسليم الصحفي الأسترالي جوليان أسانج مؤسس موقع ويكيليكس في 2006 الذي أحدث ثورة في مهنة الصحافة. هي المحاكمة المهزلة والاستهزاء بأي مظهر من مظاهر العدالة التي لطالما تغنت بها المملكة المتحدة. إنها وصمة عار. ذنب أسانج الوحيد أنه أقدم على ما يقوم به أفضل الصحفيين، وهو أداء مهنته بمهنية من خلال إماطة اللثام عن الكثير من الحقيقة. هو أجبر من ارتكبوا كل تلك الجرائم على النظر في المرآة ومواجهة قبحهم المقيت. ولعل جون بيلجر الصحفي والمخرج السينمائي الأسطوري الذي حضر المحاكمة قال عقب ذاك: لقد تم القضاء على العدالة البريطانية بهذه المحاكمة. لم يعد بوسعنا أن نضع كلمتي العدالة والبريطانية في ميزان واحد، إذ لم تكن هناك إجراءات قانونية واجبة في هذه المحكمة، بل كان هناك انتقام واجب. جريمة أسانج هي أنه أدى خدمة عامة بطولية، الكشف عما يحق لنا أن نعرفه من أكاذيب الحكومات الغربية وجرائم الحرب التي ما فتئت ترتكبها باسم شعوبها. إن فكرة أدموند بيرك عن الصحافة الحرة باعتبارها سلطة رابعة هي الآن سلطة خامسة تسلط الضوء على أولئك الذين يقللون من قيمة ومعنى الديمقراطية بسريتهم الجنائية. هذا هو السبب أن عقوبة جوليان أريد لها أن تكون شديدة وقاسية للغاية. اليوم جوليان أسانج، غدا من التالي. للوقوف عند هذا الحدث والهجوم الشرس على الحريات والقوانين التي تحميها، يطيب لنا أن نستقبل من العاصمة النمساوية فيينا الصحفي ريتشارد مدورست الذي واكب هذه المحاكمة. أهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعوا. Richard Mederis, British Syrian journalist and commentator. Welcome to Min الداخل from the inside, Richard.
Hi, Zainab. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Pure pleasure to have you. Well, Julian Assange's extradition trial at London's Old Bailey was a charade. The prevailing atmosphere has been shocking, as described by observers. It was another day in court for the only journalist in the West imprisoned for doing his job. Richard, you have been there. Describe, please, that day and what people might not know and need to.
Yeah, so I was at the extradition hearing. I attended it, and from start to finish, over the course of 4 weeks, it was really a show trial. You know, the judge, I felt that she was extremely biased in favor of the U.S. prosecution. She tried to rush through the witnesses as fast as possible, which culminated on day 17 and day 18, which were the last days, in the defense having to read the witness statements and summarize them and condense them as fast as possible instead of actually having the witnesses come and testify. And there was also one moment which really stuck out to me where we had a man, a German citizen of Lebanese origin called Khaled al-Masri, who was kidnapped and handed over by the Macedonian government to the CIA to be tortured, and he was completely innocent. And the European Court of Human Rights ended up paying him compensation and finding the Macedonian government guilty, and including the CIA in their court ruling as having tortured him. And the judge tried to block his witness statement at first, at which point Julian Assange actually yelled out from the dock that he won't tolerate for a witness statement of a torture victim to be censored, which is actually, I think, the only time that he really spoke during the whole 4 weeks, which is quite extraordinary, that even in his darkest time, he's still defending a torture victim. And so afterwards, we tried to get Khaled al-Masri to testify via video link, and surprisingly, that didn't work. You know, as I remarked yesterday, I think it's incredible how when the US and UK governments want to assassinate people using drone strikes, the video link is always working.
But
when a torture victim... Yeah, but when a torture victim wants to testify, and that's damaging for the U.S. prosecution, all of a sudden he's not made available, and the judge did not even want to give him time to find another means to come and testify. And I thought that was very disrespectful. And of course, she gave more time for the prosecution to cross-examine witnesses. She let them go over the time limit, especially, and then giving them sometimes hours on one single witness. And then all of a sudden, she wants to finish with the witnesses and be done with the court cases fast as possible. And you know, at one moment, she even asked the prosecution. She asked both the prosecution and the defense if they think that the U.S. elections, the presidential elections, will affect the trial. That's a very odd question, because she's inadvertently acknowledging that this is a political trial. And of course, if it's a political trial, it has to be thrown out under the extradition treaty and under any kind of judiciary and jurisdiction, whether be it European or international or British or American. So there's so many violations of all of these jurisdictions.
Richard, the Assange trial is the political trial of the century, as it was described. It's clear today that with the political persecution against the man, the truth teller who exposed corruption and war crimes, this will not end here. Rather, it's only the first chapter in a big fat volume of attacks against press freedom and those daring to divulge the truth. How much do people really understand that this freedom in the world is at stake today, Richard?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think they understand enough. You know, there was barely any coverage from mainstream media, and even some of my colleagues in independent media did not bother covering this. You know, they made maybe one video, one report of 10 minutes, and then never spoke about it ever again. And I think this is very shocking because, as you said, it is the trial of the century, as many have described it, including myself. And it is very egregious what this holds for press freedoms everywhere, because the United States is effectively reaching its tentacles all the way across the Atlantic and just kidnapping journalists now at will. This is utterly insane. I mean,
and extraditing them.
To think that,
True.
Exactly, yes. And of course, the extradition treaty itself is very one-sided, but just as a whole, this notion that the United States can apply U.S. law in a United Kingdom courtroom in Europe and get away with it is extremely frightening. Does this mean next they're going to kidnap me, or does this mean they're going to kidnap someone in China? I mean, what's going to happen here with this extraterritorialization of crimes? And of course, we can discuss further how Julian Assange is not a criminal at all to begin with, but the fact that the United States is able to bully its so-called allies and just snatch journalists and pretend that it's applying the law is very concerning. And I don't think people understand how grave this is and what this holds for press freedoms. You know, people should be up in arms about what's going on here, because, you know, the very nature of what Assange exposed is political. He exposed government wrongdoing, he exposed torture, he exposed rendition, he exposed assassination programs, he showed how the United States will also bully its allies in order to suppress any kind of investigation into its own intelligence services that commit these crimes abroad. And that's why they're after him. It's not because he actually committed a crime, it's because he exposed their crimes.
Right. Now, the Assange effect is already being felt across the world, Richard. If they displease the regime in Washington, investigative journalists are liable to prosecution under the 1917 U.S. Espionage Act. Well, this has irritated many editors from newspapers, including the Washington Post and the New York Times, as well as press freedom organizations, characterizing it as an attack on the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees, of course, freedom of the press. We should all ask, and you asked this question, who is next and why this act, Richard?
Well, the 1917 Espionage Act, since its inception, it was designed as a political tool. It's never been about prosecuting spies. It's always been about imprisoning people who speak out against the government in ways that the government does not like. Eugene Debs was a presidential candidate in the United States, and he was jailed in 1918 using the Espionage Act because he spoke out against World War I. And he was jailed for 10 years, and they stripped him of his citizenship. He wasn't a journalist. He didn't expose any wrongdoing. He merely spoke out. He just gave a speech against the First World War, and that was enough to jail him. So by design, it's always been used like that. And of course, they tried to jail Daniel Ellsberg, who also testified at the trial for the Pentagon Papers. So they've tried many times before. to use it not just against a journalist but anyone. Now, of course, if extradited to the U.S., it's surely guaranteed that Assange will be convicted and held in a supermax prison under these extremely inhumane conditions.
Richard, allow me to ask you, let me take you back to talk about the judge. Before we talk about the conditions where Assange is being held and how this is directly affecting his psychological interaction. Now, you talked about the judge's dubious or egregious approach, the moments of collusion between the judge, Vanessa Barretzer, about whom little is known, of course, and the prosecution acting for the Trump regime have been brazen, as they say. Until the last few days, defense arguments have been routinely dismissed. Some strongly expect that the final decision was already made in this case, even before opening arguments were received. Is that so? What's your sense?
Unfortunately, I think that's the case because the mere fact that she allowed this trial to proceed in the first place indicates a bias. I mean, Julian Assange was being held on an outdated indictment. What is that? That's a violation of the most basic fundamentals of any legal system. He's held on an old indictment, and she kept him in jail anyway. And then the U.S. submitted a superseding indictment past the deadline. And she accepted it anyway and decided to proceed. And even though it contained no new charges whatsoever, it's just added conduct, as they say, conduct, which alleged that Julian Assange was some kind of cyber criminal. And this would, of course, lead to more harsher sentencing afterwards. You also have to consider that the Judge Barretzer, who, as you said, little is known about her, but from the little we do know, she has a 96% extradition record. So it's very likely she will rule in favor of extradition. And moreover, the judge overseeing her, Lady Arbuthnot, who is a chief magistrate in Westminster, has just been promoted to the High Court in the UK just this week, which is very dubious because she herself, she oversees Judge Barretzer and other judges. Her family has ties to the intelligence services in the UK, to the
so as we said, it's a charade. It's a charade at the end of the day.
It is.
Right. Now, Richard,
it truly is.
Sure. Allow us to stop for a short break, and then afterwards we're going to talk more into the Julian Assange trial. But after the break, إذا فاصل قصير ونعود. لا تذهبوا بعيدا. أهلا بكم من جديد. Richard Medorist, British Syrian journalist and commentator. Welcome back to من الداخل from the inside, Richard. Allow me to take you back to talk about the conditions where Julian Assange is being held and how he's being treated. The judge's decision will be known, of course, on the 4th of January 2021. Till then, would he stand strong? As far as Assange told John Pilger, who visited him, that he's losing his mind, and he told him of being actually drugged. Pilger said that Julian's resilience and courage are formidable, but there is a limit to everything. So what's your take on that, Richard?
Yes, it's extremely concerning. I read Pilger's account of his visit to Assange, and Assange doesn't even know what they're giving him, which, I mean, this is extremely frightening and concerning. Moreover, yeah, it's true Julian Assange has been resilient. We have to consider that he was arbitrarily detained for 7 years inside of the Ecuadorian embassy, and the UN was very clear on that this is arbitrary detention and it is torture. And then, of course, he spent 18 months now in Belmarsh prison, which is a maximum security category A prison. I visited the prison from the outside, and I was told to stop filming by the guards. It is extremely harrowing that we are putting a journalist in the same place where terrorists are put. That should tell you everything you need to know. And of course, Julian Assange is already in solitary confinement inside of the UK in Belmarsh prison. He's placed 23 hours a day inside of his cell. And if he's sent to the US, I mean, the doctors, the medical experts, who all testified during this hearing were very clear that this presents a heightened risk of suicide, and that it is very likely that Assange will take his own life, if not at least try to take his own life, if extradited. So I cannot overstate the gravity of the situation in terms of his physical and mental health, as the medical experts who testified during the hearing can also attest.
Right. Now, Richard, if independent media want to be a real counterweight to establishment media, they must challenge the status quo in its entirety. Why are you so outraged at the alternative media to the extent of naming some journalistic malpractices?
Because one would assume that because they're not beholden to corporate donors, that they would have more freedom to cover the topics that they like. And so one has to ponder why they're not doing this. I think this is beyond journalistic malpractice. I think it's laziness. I think it's extremely disappointing and disgusting behavior. We expect CNN, we expect all of these big American corporate news media outlets not to cover this because they don't do national security journalism. They're not interested in actually providing a counterweight to the establishment narrative. They are an arm, or they're a propaganda tool of the national security state. So you turn to independent media hoping that they will pick up the torch and they will actually get the job done. And unfortunately, the vast majority of them have been absolutely silent. I'm working with a fraction of the budget that some of these independent journalists have, and I went directly to the court and I attended this hearing and covered it myself, and I'm not the only one. Kevin Gostola was waking up at the crack of dawn every day to cover this hearing. We really put in a lot of work, and it's really disappointing to see them abandoning this case, especially when it concerns them, because they're next on the chopping block if Julian Assange is now being tried for this.
Right. In a similar vein, Richard, recently the US, the UK and France blocked testimony at the United Nations Security Council from a former Director General of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, and a former senior OPCW inspector. The testimony, of course, regarding the investigation into an alleged chemical weapons attack in Douma in Syria in April 2018. What evidence does this action provide?
So it's very interesting, of course, this case, because the documents that were made public, that were disclosed, came from WikiLeaks, from Julian Assange's organization. And of course, the fact that we had the testimony of former Director General Bustani blocked is extremely telling. I mean, once again, we are seeing these Western European nations, the UK, France, the United States, abusing the United Nations Security Council and turning it into a mockery, as they did in 2003 when Colin Powell lied, giving over an hour of a presentation about weapons of mass destruction that don't exist. And so once again now we're dealing with a topic of extreme importance. We're dealing with WMDs again, and allegations that were used to conduct a bombing campaign in Syria in April 2018. And they're trying to cover it up again and block testimony from a body that is supposed to be impartial, that is supposed to be a non-state objective actor, and give us the truth. And of course, they blocked testimony from people who were at the site in Douma, Inspector Henderson and Inspector B. So it's extremely telling what they're trying to do here. They're trying to cover up their wrongdoing. They're trying to cover up their lies and maintain this myth that some gas attack took place in Douma, when all of the scientific evidence points to the contrary.
Right. Now, you tweeted recently that leaked emails were provided to me showing how the BBC, on behalf of Her Majesty's government, are indirectly threatening journalists who question the official narrative on Syria with legal action. Tell us more. I would appreciate if you can divulge more, Richard, today. And can you name some of those journalists?
Just to summarize briefly, there are a few journalists who've been living in Syria, Western journalists, and they've done extensive coverage on the White Helmets. Now, the White Helmets, they've been marketed as a civil defense group in the West. They won an Oscar documentary about them.
The Angels, the Angels. Yes. Yes, of course. And the BBC has been one of these outlets, of course, which has invested heavily in marketing them as angels. And they're now doing a new piece Vanessa
on them.
Bielie, she has done a lot extensive writing on this particular issue.
There we go. Right. So she is one of the journalists who's been contacted by the BBC, and indirectly threatened her with legal action from the UK government. So this is extremely concerning that we are seeing not just the Assange trial taking place in the UK, but we are seeing all across the board, anyone who goes against the official narrative, be it the OPCW, be it war crimes in Iraq, be it the White Helmets, they're coming after them. And it doesn't matter how big they are, because, you know, if you want to argue that, okay, Julian Assange has a lot of political capital behind him, he has WikiLeaks organization and a big target on his back, sure, you could say that, but now they're going after everyone. And none of these is okay. I mean, whether it's Assange or anyone else, it's not okay. And we have to call this out and we have to expose it for what it is, because once again, who's next?
Right. An observer asks, is it all right for 7.5 million Palestinians to remain refugees even as dictators are propped and war criminals called peacemakers? Why do more than half the American public think Trump is a pathological liar, but then do not challenge his lies about the apartheid state of Israel? Richard.
Yeah, that's always been a point of extreme interest to me, because we see often from the neoliberal establishment and from corporate media that pretend to oppose Trump, they're always interested in bringing up Russiagate and fantasies where they pretend that they are standing in opposition to Trump. But when it comes to real issues where they can oppose Trump, including the question of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, complete silence. You know, there's been no kind of pushback from corporate media or from the so-called left in the United States about Trump naming Jerusalem the capital of Israel, or recognizing it as such, or recognizing the occupied Golan Heights as being part of Israel. No pushback whatsoever. And there's been no pushback either on these so-called peace deals, which have completely undermined any kind of Arab unity in terms of the Palestinian question, and been nothing but a blatant normalization of ties with murderous regime that calls itself the State of Israel. So Donald Trump, they're more than happy to call him a liar and a fascist, but when it comes to things like Palestine, when it comes to his persecution of Julian Assange, complete radio silence from them.
Right. How do you read this normalization of ties between certain kind of regimes in the Arab world and the Israeli enemy?
Well, I think it's disgusting. I think it's a complete abandonment of the Palestinian people. It's a complete abandonment of any sense of pan-Arabism, of any kind of unity between the Arab countries. Of course, we know that these countries, they've been normalizing ties with Israel for quite a while under the table. So it wasn't too surprising. But nonetheless, the fact that they're openly fine with this now and trying to pass it off as some kind of peace deal. These countries were never at war with each other.
Right. But just to close this very vibrant edition with you, Richard, we join the free moral world and demand to free Julian Assange. Yes, the arc of the moral universe may be long, but it bends towards justice. At the end of the day, Richard Medorist, British Syrian journalist, thank you very much for your audacity and vibrant articulation, Richard.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to have you. والشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا من كل فريق عمل البرنامج من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.